Welcome. Thank you for joining our IT Platforms and Virtualization Best Practice Series webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's presentation. Larry Isaacson, USDM Practice Leader, will be presenting. The discussion today will cover introductions, webinar logistics, our discussion topic, Legacy GxP Information Systems Retirement, the neglected phase of the system's life cycle. If you don't see the presentation slides on your screen, please click the Legacy Webinar tab at the top center of your screen. The USDM team is proud to have Larry in a leadership role. He offers 20 years in the application of GxP-compliant IT technology in the life science organizations. Larry has experience in manufacturing, software, development, and clinical and laboratory contract service management environments. He recently led the implementation and validation of FDA-regulated global ERP laboratory and quality management systems. He has experience in establishing IT and quality strategy, project, and change management programs. Larry has held the position of Director of IT in pharma, biotech, and medical device companies. He holds a Master of Sciences in Pharmaceutical Research Sciences. U.S. Data Management is focused exclusively in the life science domain. We're the market leader in providing IT, quality, and regulatory IT compliance professional service solutions. Our various dedicated practices include PLM, ERP, CRM, GRC, ECM, clinical, and drug safety. We are the compliance partner for many best-of-breed vendors, including Agilent, Sparta Systems, TrackWise, OpenText, ECM, Oracle, and SAP. We're headquartered in Ventura, California, and we've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 130 life science clients. We do offer hands-on experience in assisting clients under regulatory distress, and we're a market leader for validation accelerator packs. The content today will be covered in approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll invite you to post questions for our team via the iLink message board on the lower left of your screen. Or you can join a discussion on LinkedIn and post questions there. If your question is of a confidential nature, we're happy to address that offline as well. The contact is rmelody@usdatamanagement.com. We appreciate you making the time to join us today. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Larry.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you for joining us. Wanted to touch on the agenda that we'll be covering on this very important topic that most people don't think about very much. System retirement is all about data management and compliant record and data retention. And we're going to explore what the challenges are related to that within the context of an SDLC, which is basically the framework that describes how you invoke as well as retire systems. We'll also explore why system retirement is neglected, and that gives us a lot of insight into what the challenges are and how to meet them. We'll talk about what the impact is of this neglect. And there's both benefits and there's negative factors involved with ignoring this, surprisingly. And what's the solution? What's the best practice approach to be able to handle this in an effective manner and avoid some of the negativity, but also get some of the benefits of having a legacy system managed? We'll also talk about a system retirement process in outline form. There's just too much to go into detail in 30 minutes, and this is a big topic. But we'll give you a sense of what is involved if you want to take a structured approach to this, and then we'll summarize and deal with questions. So in terms of the requirements associated with record and data retention, in Part 11, there are some elements that are indicated that often aren't talked about very much or thought of by IT and quality, because most of our effort is put into developing systems and not so much after their life is in production use is over. But you can see that we are required to protect data for accurate and ready retrieval throughout the records retention period. And that word protect, I think, connotes a certain higher level of standard of accountability for the data throughout its lifetime than most people typically expect. The accurate and ready retrieval is something people are generally pretty much aware of, and they think of that in terms of being able to get reports out of systems. But once those systems have gone past their lifespan, that becomes a lot more problematic, as we'll see. I wanted to explore the idea of record retention period. Again, this is an area that most people have not spent a lot of time thinking about. And once you start digging into it, you can be very surprised at how extensive this record retention area is. And your records department and your legal department are very much aware of this. And if you've ever been through a discovery process in a legal proceeding, you discover how important that becomes. But from a GxP perspective, there are quite a few requirements in the predicate rules about retention of data, and you'd be very surprised in some cases that clinical trial data is required to be kept pretty much for the life of the compound once it's on the market. So there's you can be looking at decades of records retention that have to be understood and maintain the ability to retrieve that data. To compound that further, you've also got to take into account business and legal hold requirements that have other unique data retention requirements. If there's a legal proceeding or some other type of action going on, or even an HR, human resources issue, you can find that data that might be related to the work done during a particular period is needed to be retained beyond the record retention period the company might have established. So when you go back to the requirements here in Part 11, it stipulates that FDA has the access to review and copy such records accurately at any time during the record retention period. So not only are you required to be able to retrieve it for business purposes and in general for regulatory purposes, but there's really a need to be able to do so in response to the FDA during an audit. During the lifetime of this data. And as we all know, one of the most important aspects of being able to respond to an FDA query is the speed and accuracy with which you can reply. And there's nothing more difficult than having to tell the FDA that you have to go back and find this data in Iron Mountain somewhere because you don't have an index, or you just don't know who to talk to yet to find this information. So this could become a real issue during an audit or an inquiry. And of course, since the record retention period of a lot of data exceeds the life of any one system that is housing it or created it in terms of its databases and transactions, we as IT organizations within a regulated entity must manage data compliantly across system transitions by definition. So, and the compliantly word is important here. It's one thing to just be able to move data around electronically or put it into an archive or onto tape, which people think is sufficient. But when you take into account all of the rules related to being able to access the data and the different scenarios and being able to do so compliantly with the accountability and traceability that's expected, that puts a much different wrinkle in the challenge. So the solution to this within the IT realm, of course, is the system development lifecycle. This is a well-regarded standard that's imbued in many different bodies of standards that people refer to. If you look at the GAMP5, of course, it's a foundational framework for being able to have accountability for system development. ISO, of course, has it well ensconced there. ITIL, it's foundational for that. COBIT, and SOX as well. So in general, the system development lifecycle is the framework that people use to represent good practice in IT from a system development perspective, and it also includes a phase of system retirement and disposition at the end of life. But unfortunately, most people don't look at much detail as to how that actually happens. We just know it's there. It has to happen at some point, usually by default when the vendor stops supporting something or people just have to bite the bullet. But it's often not considered a very structured approach the way system development is in SDLC. That's what we see when we work with clients when they're dealing with these transitions. And of course, there's a wide variety of risk assessment methodologies baked into these frameworks, because you use risk to assess the approach you're going to use, both for the system development process as well as for the, as you'll see, the system retirement process. And you've got to do this within a framework of quality management and project management, of course. So there's just as you used a quality management system and you had quality organization involved with the development of these GxP systems, there's a similar requirement for them, for this framework to be applied for the retirement and disposition phase of systems. So the goal is you want to have a defined phase of development implementation, controlled system and data transitions with auditable documentation that meets compliance standards. That's what use of the SDLC framework within a regulated environment is meant to achieve at a high level. So how do you go about doing that? Well, within the classic SDLC architecture, you have your typical phases of system requirement, to design and test, implement and deploy, operational maintenance, and disposal and retirement. And the processes we have during the inception of systems in terms of requirements involve many elements such as the ROI analysis, RFP development, URS, FRS, and a whole spate of approvals, which is not trivial. You've got your design and test process, which, depending on whether it's customer or off-the-shelf package, may or not involve a design specification. You've got your installation and integration, your vendor audits, your user acceptance tests, and then your compliance testing, and all the approvals that go with it. So there's a lot of time spent in this phase prior to the actual deployment and the rollout process, which involves training in a compliant manner, data migration plans if there's legacy systems being moved away from, user documentation and global rollouts, as well as many other factors I'm not going to go into here, to get a system out and into production with a compliant framework in place. Obviously, the change control and all the rest of it is underlying this. And you've got your operational phases where you're doing your ongoing monitoring, you're doing routine updates within a compliance framework, and of course you've got your call center, which I should have had a bullet in here for that, which is your ongoing monitoring and management of the system and the business process it's supporting. When it comes to the end of life, though, there isn't a lot talked about in terms of what the structure is going to be here. This is an area that we just see in the field has not been well thought through and not defined, except at a very high level. So we want to give a little more on the bones here. Just wanted to mention that in order to make this all happen, you've got a whole slew of organizations involved. Your PMO, your application development groups, quality units, your DBAs, call center, data centers, tape archives, financial analysts, and obviously this is not a complete list that we've used to get these systems into production. And we focus most of our effort on new systems and processes. We focus a lot of effort on upgrading and replacing legacy systems. That's where the 90%, I would say, of the management attention is, because we want to increase ROI. There's a constant stream of new system requirements coming from the business, along with a new stream of compliance requirements that accompany it often that we have to deal with. At the same time, we want to maintain the business continuity and maintain compliance through all of these new system transitions. So this is where the majority of the effort and attention of the organization is focused, and this is what people think of in terms of good IT practice in a compliant framework. So why is the retirement phase neglected? Well, if anyone has ever had to deal with this in the real world, anyone talking about deleting data or purging data, the eyes typically get very wide around the table, especially of the QA people, because there's a fear of compliance risk. Many questions come up in terms of how to apply, what kind of questions might come up in an audit, where are we going to find the data, how are we going to get to it. It's always easier to leave something in place and know where it is because it's been there for a long time than to deal with the complexity of change. And so there's an immediate fear of how we're going to deal with the compliance risk when at least we have a known state at this time. There's a low apparent ROI. People aren't getting kudos for retiring systems typically. It's what new systems have you gotten in place and how have you done against budget and forecasted schedules. So it doesn't appear that there's a lot of payback for retiring systems or disposing of assets. And obviously manpower. We just don't have the people to deal with this. It's a distraction, from the primary mission. And there just isn't a good roadmap as to how to approach this. Not to mention the compliance risk, just the methodology and how do you start decomposing these very highly integrated systems that have been in place for a long time. And to some degree, some of the institutional memory may have faded if these systems have been in place for 5 years or more, or have been brought through through acquisitions, which is often the case. And there's really no designated responsibility. If you look at an org chart in IT or quality, you typically don't see anybody designated as the chief system retirement officer. So this is an added complexity. And as a result, what you see, and I've seen it, when you go into clients and who are trying to deal with this, you've got an abandoned legacy of GxP systems in stasis. We sort of call them the living dead. In many cases, they are partially in production. But I've been sort of shocked when I've seen the extent of this, these boat anchors, how many are really there. It's an inventory of all the systems in some cases that have ever been marketed are sitting around in a semi-production state. So this is an area where people have started to have to address them because there is some risk associated with that as well as cost. So I wanted to explore a little bit about what's the impact of leaving things as is the way with these legacy systems in place. There are some benefits, not surprisingly. The reason these things are left in place is because you do have rapid access to critical data when these systems are still there. Everyone's been trained up on them. People know that it's validated, that the data has high integrity. There's a lot of, typically, at least in the early stages, a lot of knowledge around how to use those systems. So, and not so much on the new system that may have replaced it. So there's some real comfort in having those systems around, as well as real productivity possible when it comes to responding to audits and typical business needs in the first year or two. You are obviously still complying with record retention requirements by having those systems in place. There are already ways to go and get information in response to any record queries. So in effect, you have started the clock on the record retention. But the question of when the clock starts is a large one that needs investigation in each particular scenario. You may have a schedule that says, okay, you keep this data for 5 years or 2 years, or marketing the time to market plus 2 years, and knowing what that date actually is a subject, sometimes subject to debate. And you may have duplicates. This data may exist in this system, and it may have been migrated to a new system, but it may have been transformed. So there's a lot of questions of interpretation as to what the data is that you're expected to be able to retain and in what form. Having these systems around often is beneficial because you need it to maintain interfaces. You may have a partial migration and keep portions of a system live. You may have EDI connections or other internal customized interfaces that you still want to keep around because you can't really replace them all at once. Moving, let's say, to a new ERP system or a PLM system, you may have legacy custom systems that you still need to feed in order to maintain links to partners or to other divisions. Or it may simply have come as part of an acquisition where these old systems have to be kept around for purposes of meeting reporting requirements. Again, the same applies to your data and reports and forms that everyone's been trained on, everyone knows how to interpret. You may actually run in parallel for a while with the legacy system spitting data out being compared to new system outputs. So there is a good justification in some cases for running in parallel for verification purposes in some cases, but at the same time, if you let that continue too long, you may not get full acceptance of the new system, and this is something that has to be managed. And of course, you avoid the distraction of people working on retirement of the legacy system as opposed to new systems. So everyone knows that we have a backlog of system development requirements, and that's the backlog everyone's pointing to, and they're not necessarily focused on the backlog of system retirements that come from all of the system development work. I look at these as two sides of the same coin. If you have a high level of excellence on developing systems and rolling out new capabilities, you are creating a wake of abandoned systems at the same time at a very high rate, potentially. And no one's really looking backwards. They want to look forward naturally. But the downsides, of course, are you have ongoing costs. These systems are still holding compliant data, business important data. They need to be used in a semi-production mode or being used partially that way. You've got your license fees, your maintenance fees, your labor costs, your platform costs, maintenance costs, your backup and potential recovery costs that are ongoing, as though the system was still in production. You've got compliance risk because that's real data that's subject to audit in there, both from a SOX perspective as well as a GxP perspective. And if you haven't taken some steps, there's the potential for accidental data changes, destruction, or loss if people are in there and not thinking about what they're doing. Obviously, there's a lack of training and support that's going on for that system. So if there are still being that system's used to respond to audits or for reporting, you may not have people as well trained as they used to be on that system, and you may not potentially be compliant with training requirements if new people are coming into the mix and you're not really scaled to support it the way it was when it was in production. And of course, there's more difficulty in responding to audits as the system ages, if it's still in place and it still has important data in there, because now you have to be aware of where is this information across multiple systems of record. And that can certainly complicate matters as you are trying to respond to an audit, and especially with a tight time frame. And of course, you're still managing these systems somehow. Someone's got to take care of these systems, make sure that they're being maintained. You've got live data repositories effectively across legacy systems that are effectively archives. So these are not things that can just be ignored. They have real potential value, and they have to be maintained just as though they were in production if you expect them to be available when you need them. And of course, they have to be in a position to be migrated in a compliant manner, so they have to have been maintained within the quality framework that was originally established. Unless you have established the fact that you've migrated all the data to a new system or a legacy system immediately, it's difficult to say that you don't have to still worry about this from a compliance perspective. So the solution is not an easy one, but once you've decided that this has become too much of a burden to drag around on a continuing basis, it's really important to be able to get management commitment to systematically address this issue and really look at it as a backlog of GxP system retirements. Just as you have a backlog of system development requirements and projects, you have a backlog of system retirements, which are the flip side of that development program. You know, you'd want to frame it in strategic and tactical terms within your IT and your business strategy. The fact that these are interfering with better allocation of resources as well as from a risk perspective. You would want to inventory all these systems and understand who the owners are, which is easier said than done because these owners may have moved on. It may no longer be clear who that is, especially if it was through an acquisition. Or an ownership has to be established along the way somewhere. And try to quantify the cost of the maintenance across the enterprise. When you're dealing with both the platform in terms of hardware and infrastructure, the application itself, and the data management and its security and archiving of all kinds, as well as the paper records that go along with these systems, and the training, et cetera, that may still have to be maintained, it adds up when you start looking at it. You want to understand your data and its dependencies across systems. If there are interfaces involved, you need to be able to explicitly understand them and map how the replacement systems perhaps have either superseded those dependencies or are still involved in many cases with those legacy systems. And maybe they're not ready for retirement now, but you may want to project retirement down the road in a year or two. Obviously, you need to understand your records retention requirements. So again, that depends. That's a simple sentence, but it's a lot of effort to understand that depending upon the domain the system is operating in, it may have a wide range of different record retention requirements. Ironically, what we found is that manufacturing data, once you're actually in production, often doesn't need to be maintained such as lot information much past the expiration of a lot out in the marketplace, assuming it's going to be recalled. And unlike clinical data and some of the other information that may go on for decades. You want to prioritize them by the return on investment and the risk, both the cost of the system that can be avoided by decommissioning it and the risk associated from a compliance perspective as well as a legal perspective. And you then have a structured methodology similar to an SDLC for the retirement and the data disposition process, and we're going to outline that briefly. But the main question here is who's going to take the lead. I think it is important myself for IT to take the initial lead because IT may be the only one aware of the extent of the problem and be managing it on a day-to-day basis. To at least create awareness of this issue and quantify it for the organization. But it's going to be a team effort to actually address it. This is not something that can be done by one party because there's so many people with a vested interest in these systems and the risk assessment, and we'll touch on that, what that might look like. So what we want to do is define a system retirement process. Just as you have phases of an SDLC, you have phases of a system retirement. So this isn't rocket science. It's basically just like many other IT projects. You've got an assessment that is basically looking at all of the various factors that involve a system, who the stakeholders are, what data is utilized, what interfaces and dependencies are involved, the regulatory requirements, what are the platform components. And then that is factored into a records retention assessment. This is a formal analysis where you can document exactly what is the risk and requirement associated with the data in that system or its interdependent systems. That would yield a project plan, which we're all familiar with, which would lay out in detail the phased approach to retiring the system based on an assessment of the risks and the potential use of this data post-production. So one of the things I want to emphasize is that not only are you looking at the overall risk of the data in terms of its compliance needs, but from a business perspective, you have to have some scenarios defined as to how might you need to get to this data in the near term, in the middle term, and the long term. And over time, the risk goes down. Auditability is very high in the first year in terms of people needing ready access to the information in its original form. But 2 or 3 years down the road, that may not be as critical, and there are a variety of ways to handle that in a much less costly way than keeping the production system, for all intents and purposes, in stasis. Then you, of course, would implement this plan in a structured manner, and you'd have a disposition summary report, which would, basically, if this is the validation plan over here or over here, then you've got your final report here, which documents what happened to all this information and provides your compliance framework for defense as to how you handle this information and how traceable you've maintained it. So if you come away with only one idea from this webinar, I'd like you to remember that the process of decommissioning a GxP system is a mirror image of the process of its implementation. You've got the same requirements for quality, control, and audit regarding its disposition through the end of the record retention period. And there's a variety of ways to be able to address that, but it all depends on the specific assessment of the system that you're dealing with. So what you end up with is a system retirement architecture, just like we have a system development architecture, a system retirement architecture, using the same swim lane approach of the phases of system assessment, records retention assessment, the project plan, the retirement implementation, which could be multi-phased, and the disposition summary report. You've got your inventory of your hardware and your vendors, your cost to maintain, your IQ, OQ, or PQ. This is a very interesting area when you go back into what are supposed to be compliant systems and look for the documentation that would be very helpful to help you assess this. Often that's very difficult to find, especially if the system's been around for a long time. And establishing system ownership, of course, is very important. You then would be looking at records retention schedule, other record retention requirements, record retrieval needs in terms of near-term and long-term, the risk associated with having or not having that data readily available, and the triggers that would cause you to move from one phase to the other. So you might have the first phase be an online system, locked down in stasis for the first year, year and a half, and then that moves to a hosted system or a different platform, or you virtualize it, or you actually create a separate retrieval system, or you may just output everything you can think of in PDF, and that's all you need for purposes of past the first high-risk year. So those are the kinds of things, types of thinking that would come to this phase. The planning involves not just the project, but the lockdown phase, the limited access phase, data migration plans, to the extent that you've already done that through its replacement, then you're somewhat ahead of the game, but you may have to have supplementary data migration plans. And, of course, system migrations if you're migrating the platform. And ultimately, disposals. I mean, the whole point of this is to dispose of the platform, the application, and the data ultimately. It should be out. Once it's past this records retention period, you don't want that sitting around as a potential liability. So you've got your multiple transitions that are defined for your project. You're monitoring along the way to know when your record retention period triggers are coming up. And then your final dispositions, where really by the time a certain time it goes by, you basically can say all this stuff is gone. And then you may have multiple project disposition summary reports for the different phases, where you define your objective, your milestones, here's what happened, and here's the next trigger event if there is one. In terms of the organizations involved, you've got many of the same actors that you've had in the system development cycle, except here you may have your records department involved. Perhaps you have a retirement subject matter expert within IT or legal to deal with the specific approaches and methodologies that system disposition in a compliant manner is involved. And you may have your legal department, which I should have put here, where you always want to consult them to see if there's any legal holds or any other considerations. But often the records department will be very closely coupled to them. The goals here, obviously, are to implement a compliant system retirement so that you can stand on that process and defend yourself in an audit, as well as respond to business needs along the way should historical access be required. And preventing the growth of the retirement backlog. You may have a backlog of 20 or 30 systems if you're lucky not to have more. Once you do take some steps to remove them or to get them on a path to removal, then you want to try to prevent this in the future. And one of the best ways to do that is to build this into your SDLC, to actually impose a requirement that before, at the time a system goes live, the same project team that created that new system, that replacement system, turns around and develops the plan for the migration of the legacy system to ultimate disposition. Because that's when you have all the people who know that system in place. If you wait 5 years, you'll find that institutional memory is gone, and your investigation phase could be extraordinarily painful. And so my best recommendation would be to try to build a phase of some kind in that retirement phase into system implementations so that it's not a forgotten portion of the project, and the expertise can be leveraged. Ultimately, you will improve your resource allocation because you'll have a much less painful set of issues when you come to the legacy end-of-life issue. You'll increase your ROI. You'll reduce your compliance risk because everyone will know the status of the data and where it's going and how they're going to deal with it as it gets to certain points of aging against the record retention requirement. And you'll have traceability well defined, and that's ultimately what we're really concerned about, is that traceability on an ongoing basis, developing that record along the way so that we can demonstrate in an audit that traceability is maintained even after the system is gone or data is purged or deleted or put onto a different media or put off-site, etc. So just to summarize, the costs and risks of unmanaged legacy GxP systems can become overwhelming, and we've seen it. And you basically have a daunting system retirement backlog, potentially, with regulatory and legal implications. If you take a structured approach to this backlog, you can really make a good dent in it, at least understand where you stand, where you are, and ultimately free resources for higher ROI projects. I really look at that as the flip side of system development efforts, is the system disposition aspect to retirement. If you can integrate this with your system development process, you'll prevent a lot of the future growth, or at least it'll be controlled growth or management of that backlog. And USDM stands ready to assist you based on our experience and how you can get this started and how to address retirements of specific systems if you have that. And we've seen clients who've saved millions, literally millions, in decommissioning old ERP systems and lab systems that have been sitting that are really sort of left in the lurch after the new system takes over. Thank you very much, and I'm ready for questions when you.
Thanks so much, Larry. Appreciate you sharing that solid information there. As Larry mentioned, we will open the floor for questions now. If you want to just take a moment and go ahead, and thank you for those of you that have put questions in already, but you see the chat option in the bottom left of your corner, the corner of your screen there. Larry, we'll start with our first question. It's from John. What are typical phases of a retirement plan?
Okay, that's a good question. Typically, I alluded to this in the discussion, when you look at the retirement plan, you're basing your approach on risk. So typically, the day that a system is taken out of production, you're still at a high risk from a compliance and business process perspective because, number one, you may have gaps in the new system and its functionality, and you may actually be using the system still for limited production purposes. And two, you're expected that you'll be, for SOX purposes and other regulatory purposes, you may have to access that data for routine financial reporting, et cetera. Even if you've tried to do your cutoff on the quarterly or annual financial breaks, there's still a high need for access to retrospective data. So that's typically where you would keep that system in a lockdown mode. You would lock down user access. You would put it into a read-only mode, and you designate as such, as part of a plan, how you're going to manage that system and who's going to be able to access it. That might be a year. It might be 2 years. There may be other considerations where you have actually done a data migration, a comprehensive one, where data wasn't transformed and it is still in its original state. If you actually assessed it that way, you might be able to remove the system from a sort of in-stasis production archive state sooner. No one has time to actually get to that level of detail during an implementation phase, so it's often an after-the-fact analysis. First year or two where it's considered high risk to decommission the system, you may have elements of cost reduction that could come from moving it off dedicated hardware. If it's legacy, hardware is not virtualized, and moving it to a virtualized environment. You may put it to a hosting environment, again in a virtualized environment, or you may actually export the data into a data warehouse where you can run queries using effectively a custom development process or a toolkit for the data that you've identified as the most high risk. And then the third stage may be an archive to DVD or to tape, whatever you feel is your archivists feel comfortable with, that is more of a long-term type of longer period of retention storage, or simply an output of PDFs. Once the business feels comfortable that their need is not immediate, it's not real time. So you're going from a real-time access requirement to a multiple day or week access requirement sufficiency, and phasing your approach that way.
Thank you, Larry. We'll take our next question from Andreas. He's asking actually a two-part question. Where could you find information regarding retention periods? Is there a central resource you could recommend? And the second part of the question is, what would the length of a retirement implementation execution, excuse me, from the presentation, it sounds like it could take years.
Well, again, it all depends, and that's why we have such a large assessment phase in this. The first question is you'll start with if you're working with a corporation, they've got a records retention schedule, typically that is well established within their regulatory area. And if you're in this regulated space in life sciences, it's got a very, very detailed schedule of retention requirements for all the data typically required from a business perspective. In some cases, it may actually be well done enough to actually address IT systems very specifically. And if you're lucky enough to have that, that's your first place to go, is to work with your records department and your business owners, of course, to understand both business and regulatory record retention requirements. And there may be business reasons to keep data longer than the regulatory requirements, but typically the regulatory agents, people will want to tell you, no, that's not a good justification. That's too high a liability for the company. Also, the regulations themselves stipulate, depending on whether you're talking about medical device or pharmaceutical, and what phase of the day of the development cycle for a pharmaceutical or medical device you're talking about in the case of the system. This stipulates very specifically how long data should be retained, usually with milestones such as the specific time frames of a product being put on the market, or the approval of an NDA, or the withdrawal of an item from a market, or a particular expiration of a batch. So if you look in the regulations for your specific set of products, you'll find some guidelines, and typically that's been taken into account in the records retention schedule. And this will extend not just to electronic records, but paper records, training records, batch records, paper or otherwise. So you really need to be able to understand, at least from an IT perspective, to the extent that there is a combination of both connected to the system, there's got to be a plan for all of it.
Thank you, Larry. We have a question from Nabil. Says, a two-part question again. What's the most efficient way to back up? A database backup would mean additional costs, also to maintain the database. And part two, if we archive to the text file or non-database format, what's the efficient way of reporting?
Well, a lot of that is going to depend upon what the scenario is that you need to access the data. In the first high-risk period, let's say the first year, you would want to maintain it in its database structure so that you could effectively replicate reporting, replicate real-time access, since the system's still in its validated state. And to the extent possible, you'd want to maintain that structure so you could replicate the exact same type of access that you've had if you consider this high-risk data with a real-time component to being able to get to it. When you get past that period, then you have a wide variety of options depending upon what the business and the regulatory people say is going to be the likely scenario to have to get to that data. So one common scenario, again, this is where risk fear comes in. People may not be ever comfortable with moving away from that real-time access mentality, and this is where there's a job to be made to demonstrate a true risk assessment as to why it's it's beneficial to take these cost savings and take a bit of risk. So if you output, as an example, all the possible reports, control reports as an example, that the system is typically put out based on an analysis of what is the, usually it's 20% of the reports are used 80% of the time if you're looking at static reports or standardized or validated reports. And so if you can identify those, you can make a case to say, I'm going to output all of these in the final form because the data is not being modified any longer to a PDF, a searchable PDF, and that may be sufficient for any real audit requirements down the road past, let's say, 2 years, if you can assume that this data is not being actively audited on a regular basis any longer. Or you may be able to export it to a data warehouse and develop a set of tools that allow you to query it in an ad hoc manner using the same data structure. Or you might actually do a fully custom system if you really feel that you don't, but that's a large investment that I don't see people doing. Archiving to tape in terms of a backup and restore is typically what IT considers sufficient, but in reality it's not a true archive unless you maintain the same database version, the same platform capability, etc. You can't really reproduce that data in its original form 5 years down the road, perhaps, if it was a true just database dump, an export and an import. So typically it has to be done in an archival manner, but there is some, you really have to do some analysis as to what is the scenario for its ultimate use that you're going to address.
Thank you, Larry. Let's see. Here's another question. Would you think that an upgrade to a materially new version of the same system, including data conversion, requires a system decommission?
Requires a system decommission? Is that the question?
Asking if it requires a system decommission.
Well, depending on the context of the data migration, what we find typically with data migrations, assuming it was done well and it was well planned, and is the question of, is it thinking about legacy data utilization? So often, as part of the benefits of a new system, not all the data is migrated, or it's transformed to represent the new way the company wants to measure itself, or dates are realigned for new ways of measuring the company or reporting on activity. So it's rare that you can just say the new system is going to exactly represent the original data coming from the legacy system. If that is the case, if you can assert that based on the details of the data migration plan and the technical design, then you might have a case to say, look, my new archive is my new system. My archive for my legacy data is the new system. That's a great place to be able to be, but you have to really test that you can stand behind that. And then you could completely turn the old system off. However, because you are doing you're dealing with regulated data, you have to have documented all that rationale, and the process through which that system is turned off needs to be defined. So the disposition process of a qualified system, a validated system, needs to be just as well documented as its inception, and approved by QA and approved by the business.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, we'll take our last question here, and it's kind of an echo of the earlier question regarding the length of retirement implementation execution. It's asking basically what would be the length of a retirement implementation execution.
Well, depending upon how well it was planned and the size of the system and its number of interfaces, it can be as short as 3 to 6 months, or it could be a year, depending upon the extent of. So an example, the most extensive case I've seen is where they decided to build a custom data warehouse for retrieval of actually more than one system's data that was being simultaneously retired and replaced, which is often the case for large ERP implementations you find, where they wanted to basically keep the supply chain context within a data warehouse, but not have all the the maintenance fees associated with maintaining the ERP system and application in place. So they determined that a hosted data warehouse with a defined database structure made for query was the way they were going to do that, with a front end for querying and reporting purposes, based on the original design, and because they used a reporting tool that they were going to for data warehousing in the transactional system for reporting, they just extracted that and basically created a repository for reporting. But that took them really a year to finish, and that's basically a system development project. And they had a data migration plan that defined exactly the traceability from the legacy system to the new database. And they also, along the way, printed out as PDF every report from the original system before it was turned off that was required as a control report as a backup. So they had both a live repository and they also had the archival repository of the data. That's like belt and suspenders.
Tremendous. Thank you so much. Thank you for the clarification. We appreciate that. Those of you that have, we have one more question, Larry, if we can take just another moment. What about the role of configuration management as systems are phased out? As certain attributes of the systems are phased out, shouldn't configuration management of the system be considered too in the retirement process?
Yes. But, obviously I didn't go into the detail of every element, but the integration, the actual design and the platform are one of the interfaces, the platforms, and the ultimate configuration is paramount to the determination of how you're going to actually migrate the system, depending on what approach you're going to take. So at the very least, for a system where people are too risk averse to really take it out of its original production architecture or configuration, apart from the interfaces, moving it from its dedicated production capacity platform to a smaller virtualized platform with the original versions of databases and operating systems is one of the most cost-effective ways to take a bite out of the support costs without really dealing with all the ramifications of changing the architecture, transforming the data to a new media, et cetera, and that might be the first step of middle ground. But the whole idea is that this system is under change control, just like it was in production. Even though it's sitting there and no one's doing any transactions, you're under change control. It's still within your quality framework. You've got to deal with its configuration change, however you go about it, in the same manner you would if you were upgrading the system or updating the system with new versions. So if you take that mindset and apply it, the entire structure of ITIL and COBIT and GAMP apply to that disposition process.
Thank you so much. Boy, tremendous questions. To those of you that have asked if there would be a recording of this session that I can provide, certainly. The session has been recorded and will be available on our website, which of course is usdatamanagement.com. We have a question, will there be another presentation in future? Muthu, I'm not sure if you're asking if this session itself will be repeated or if you're looking for additional information on the same topic. Just clarify for me and I'll address that offline for you. If you have additional questions that come up in the next few days or so, feel free to contact me. Again, it's rmelody@usdatamanagement.com. You can see there on the screen. And we will be posting a discussion on our LinkedIn homepage. There's a USDM group that we're happy to address questions there as well. Larry, it's a tremendous presentation today. Thank you so much for sharing the solid information there. And to all of you that joined us and stayed on through all of the question and answers, we certainly appreciate that. We do encourage you to follow up with questions and such. Let us know how we can help, and certainly we're open to your feedback for continual improvement. And with that, on behalf of the USDM team, we appreciate the opportunity to team with you towards excellence and compliance. Have a wonderful day.